Hello and welcome to the first episode of On the Fringe. And you might be asking yourself, what is On the Fringe supposed to be? Well, it's a series I decided to start because oftentimes when I'm looking at army lists for different 2000 point videos or to get a feel of how different armies play, I find a lot of lists that do rather well in tournaments but don't quite make the top 4 but do finish within the top half of the tournament. And oftentimes those lists have a lot of interesting stuff going on, though many times they're not necessarily representative of what an army looks like in most cases, so I don't really always have a place to put them, and many times it's just a single list for an army, making it a little hard to make a full video around it. And as such, I decided to make a series where I take a look at some of these more unique army lists that do bring something different to the table that maybe we don't see in many cases. And the reason the series is called On the Fringe is because the army lists we'll be looking at here are pretty much on the fringe of both being on the fringe of being top tier army lists as they performed rather well, as well as army lists that are a little more on the fringe side in terms of the units that they choose to include. In this installment of On the Fringe, we're going to be taking a look at two different lists, being a Necron list and an Admech list. So at the end of the video, do let me know which list you thought was more interesting and brought more unique things to the table, as well as which faction you think is overall more interesting, considering I have quite a lot of viewers from both the Admech community and the Necron community at this point. In any case, let's get right into the list by taking a look at the Necron list first, and then looking at the Admech list. And if you're interested in learning about either of these factions, do check out their individual series, as there's quite a lot of information in terms of how the different units in these lists perform and how the armies function overall as a whole. And with that being said, there's definitely going to be a lot of interesting similarities to these lists, even though they're from very different factions and play a little bit differently in each situation. It's going to be interesting to see how they compare to one another by the end of the video. And to begin, we'll start by looking at our first list, which is the Necron list. And this first list placed 7th out of 28 players in the Return to IWTS tournament, played by a player named Matthew Halawadi. This list begins with a rather standard battalion detachment composed of a custom dynasty. However, right off the bat, it begins with something interesting, bringing the classic Eternal Conquerors. However, it does not take Relentless Expansionist, but rather brings Healthy Paranoia. And for many of you, you're wondering, what does Healthy Paranoia do? Well, it adds 3 inches to the range of any ranged weapons that are not pistol weapons. So that's something that's already a little bit different, though you'll quickly see that there probably is a good reason for that as we look at this list. Now, as this is a battalion detachment, you are required to take some HQ choices, with the first HQ choice being an Overlord, and this Overlord is the Warlord of this army list. This Overlord comes armed with a Hyperphase Glaive and a Tachyon Arrow. More so, he has been given the trait of Inspiring Leader, and unlike the list that we saw within the Necron 2000 point list video, this one does not actually make as much utilization of this Warlord trait as that list did, so it is a little bit more perplexing in this situation, though it does show that this Warlord trait isn't as dead as one might believe, and leadership might be taking more of a center stage role within the game than we initially thought. Maybe it's a countermeasure to some abilities that do target your leadership, so that could be a situation where this might have a little more of a meta situational use than that of being something for the army list specifically. Now for the second HQ choice, this list includes a Chronomancer with the Entropic Lance. And once again, this shows that the Chronomancer is playable despite the points increase that he saw within the game. In addition to that, this Chronomancer is used to carry a relic known as the Veil of Darkness. As we mentioned before, the Veil of Darkness is a commonly seen relic on buff units such as Cryptex, as it allows them to get a unit into position and then support that unit once it is in position. Generally, Veil of Darkness is one of the stronger relics within the Necron forces, so that's why it becomes so ubiquitous within the different armies. Following the Chronomancer, there is in fact the third HQ choice, in the situation being a Technomancer. So it does show that a mix of Cryptex is still alive and well within the army list of the Necrons. And the Technomancer doesn't have any upgrades, which is a little bit different, as normally you give him the upgrade that gives him a little bit more mobility, though in this case it just seems like he's going to be walking on foot as opposed to gliding around the battlefield like he normally does. A little bit different, but if you're tight on points, that's definitely a reason to leave him on foot. Now, after the 3 HQ choices come the 3 troop choices that a battalion detachment is required to take. The first of these troop choices is a unit of 5 Immortals, and unlike most Immortals that we've seen in the past, this unit of 5 Immortals comes armed with Tesla carbines, and that's quite a big difference, as normally we see them with those Gauss Blasters that do tend to perform a little bit better than the Tesla carbines, as the Gauss Blasters have armor penetration and as such are a little more heavy hitting than their Tesla carbine counterpart. That being said, this player could be expecting to see a lot of swarm units or units with bad armor saves that have a decent toughness and have a large volume of models within a unit, thus benefiting from the additional hits on the Tesla carbines, but not really caring if they have that armor penetration or not. That being said, it's definitely an interesting include, and we'll see by the other 2 troop choices that this player is not afraid of mixing different weapons and units within his lists. The following 2 troop choices are 2 units of 20 Necron warriors, and these Necron warriors have a bit of a different arming scheme, with the first unit being armed with Gauss flares, and the second unit of these Necron warriors is armed with Gauss Reapers. This is a bit of an interesting mix, but not one that we don't really see in other situations, as it's not that uncommon to have a mix of the 2 different weapons within an army list. The reason for this being is that the Gauss Reapers allow you to have a little bit more mobility and benefit more from the Veil of Darkness, while the Gauss flares allow you to pick an objective, sit on it, and then fire at a distance, especially with the increased range from Healthy Paranoia. In addition to that, what's most likely happening here is the Gauss Reapers are being teleported by the Chronomancer with the Veil of Darkness, while the Technomancer is escorting the unit of 20 Necron warriors with the Gauss flares. In that sense, you have your different buff units spread out a little bit more, and you have that mixed firepower in order to target different units on the battlefield. It's definitely an interesting mix, and it shows quite a different variety of different troop units that you can include within an army list. This list continues on with one elite choice being a Catan Shard of the Void Dragon, and the Shard of the Void Dragon is definitely one of the most beautiful models that the Necron line has to offer. But aside from that, like all Catan, the Void Dragon is definitely a powerful model, but it definitely benefits from a vehicle heavy meta. However, considering the large amount of troops this list brings, this Void Dragon can actually serve as a little bit of an anti-tank unit, thus giving you a little bit of a better mix of different types of firepower that you have within your army, as the different troops can target different mid-range units and weak swarm units, while the Void Dragon goes after heavily armored targets. And that theory goes along with the Catan power that the Void Dragon has taken, being the antimatter meteor, indicating that it's most likely targeting individual big units as opposed to targeting smaller units with its different powers. That being said, all of the Catan are incredibly heavy hitters and make for very durable units in a lot of situations. So even though the Void Dragon does target vehicles more so than swarm units, it's still a perfectly fine unit to use against mid-range units. Now, following the elite slot, there are 2 fast attack choices, with the first fast attack choice being a unit of 5 Scarab Swarms that are most likely used to take objectives and just be a nuisance to your opponent, as the Scarabs can be rather durable and annoying to deal with due to their small size and rather significant durability. Now, the second fast attack choice is definitely an interesting one, being a unit of 4 Tomb Blades, and in this case the Tomb Blades are only armed with 4 particle beamers. This is most likely a cost-saving measure. However, we did see the Tesla carbines on the Immortals, so there is more indication that this was more of a conscious choice than simply saving points. Though that being said, there is a question of why these Tomb Blades don't have any Shadow Looms or Shield Veins on the unit at all, considering that it would give them quite a good amount of durability, and really you could have taken that on 1 Tomb Blade and thus kind of benefited the entire squad by doing so. Though that being said, the Tomb Blades are definitely an interesting unit, as they're incredibly fast moving and they can park an objective and hold it rather well, with their Eternal Conquerors part of their custom dynasty. And I definitely like them as a model. In addition to that, they're not the weakest unit and they can be rather durable. Though with that being said, once again, not having Shield Veins or Shadow Loom is a little bit of a downside to them, though I can see not including it in the situation that you're really tight on points. For the heavy support choice, this detachment includes 2 units of a single heavy Locust Destroyer, armed with a Gauss Destructor, and this once again shows that this list is very cognizant of the fact that there are going to be some heavily armored units that it's going to have to target with those destroyers. And this choice does play rather well with the inclusion of the Void Dragon, as all of a sudden it just adds to that anti-vehicle capabilities, while the troops do a rather good job of holding back the mid-range and swarm units, thus giving you that nice little variety there of different types of firepower. And this detachment does not end with that heavy support choice, as it includes 1 additional unit being a transport choice of the Ghost Ark. The Ghost Ark is a little bit of an interesting inclusion here, as it can't really transport any of the Necron warrior units due to their large size, but it does provide a decent amount of firepower and provides a little bit of additional support utility similar to that of the Technomancer or the Canoptic Reanimator, and as such it's an interesting unit to include, as it can put out that light firepower while supporting your Necron warriors and acting as a rather large unit for screening as well as sitting on objectives, and with all that it's also a very durable unit. So as a whole, I do think the Ghost Ark is probably a little bit underused, but at the same time, in a lot of cases, you can choose to go with the Doomsday Ark, which is probably a better choice overall, though in some situations, if you're limited on points, you can definitely consider the Ghost Ark as a substitute for the Doomsday Ark, and there is something to be said about the utility of the Ghost Ark in supporting those Necron warriors. More so, the list does not end with this one detachment, but it includes a second detachment being a patrol detachment composed of the same custom dynasty of Eternal Conquerors and Healthy Paranoia. So what does the second patrol detachment include? Well, to begin with, the HQ choice that it brings along is a Necron Lord, being armed with a War Scythe and a Resurrection Orb that has been upgraded to an extra relic of the Orb of Eternity. This Lord is most likely going to be supporting those Necron warriors, and it really does show how much this list focuses on supporting those Necron warriors, with a combination of the Necron Lord, the Chronomancer, the Technomancer, and even the Ghost Ark, because it really wants to keep those Necron warriors safe and powerful so they can do their job while some of the heavy hitters do their own thing. In addition to that Necron Lord, there is a second HQ choice, being another Chronomancer armed with an Entropic Lance. So why is there a second Chronomancer? The most likely case is that once again, it's focusing on protecting the Necron warriors, as that first Chronomancer is going to teleport away using the Veil of Darkness with a squad of Necron warriors, thus being out of position to protect the second squad that is most likely being guarded by the Technomancer and the Necron Lord. And at this point, the function of that first Ghost Arc becomes a little more clear, as the Ghost Arc is a rather mobile choice. Therefore, it has an easier time of reaching that teleport unit of Necron warriors and supporting them in the situations that it's needed, whereas that Technomancer or Lord would have a much harder time of reaching that squad of Necron warriors in order to help them out once they've been teleported across the battlefield. And that concludes all the HQ choices of this list, showing that once again the Cryptechs are still alive and well within the meta, and you can see lists that bring quite a few of them to the table. Now for the troop choice, it's another unit of 5 Immortals being armed with Tesla carbines once again showing that this player believed that there would be a lot of units with weak armor saves and quite a good amount of models. Either that, or they believed that the number of shots provided by the Tesla carbines would outweigh the benefits of the armor penetration on the Gauss blasters that are an alternative arming option to the Immortals. It's definitely interesting to see the Tesla carbines being used, as it's not something we really see in most situations. Now this detachment concludes with one heavy support choice, being another Locust Heavy Destroyer armed with a Gauss Destructor. And this is an interesting inclusion because it does show that continued focus on anti-armored capabilities, and what's interesting about this is this player has chosen to split up those 3 Heavy Destroyers in 3 individual units, as opposed to having a couple of them in one unit, or having all 3 of them within one unit. The nice thing about splitting them up this way is that he can move them to different locations in situations where their firepower isn't necessarily needed, and thus he enables himself to have some decently fast units that can move around the board and be a little bit of a nuisance from a distance, as opposed to always pigeonholing them into a specific unit that targets armored targets specifically and has much less utility. So that's something common across different lists, but it's definitely interesting to see the light firepower mixed with the heavy hitters such as that Void Dragon and the Destroyers within this list, in addition to how many support units this list does bring. And with the inclusion of this list, we did see all 3 named Catan shards being utilized within tournament play at different levels. So it's definitely good to see that all of them are viable in one way or another, and this looks like a really fun list that gives you quite a diversity of different models and units, as well as weapon types, that really brings out the variety of Necrons. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that it doesn't include some of the very typical units that we see, such as the Canoptic Wraiths, Lich Guard, or Scorpic Destroyers. So it's definitely a very different build from what we're used to seeing in top lists right now, and it's going to be kind of a theme through the other lists we're going to be looking at, because sometimes what's not included is almost as important as what is included, as it shows that the units chosen have their own functionality without just being carried by the good stuff that we see with another list, and rather you can build completely differently than what other people are doing within the meta. Now the second list we're going to look at today is the Adeptus Mechanicus list, which I think is a rather interesting list and plays like no other Admech list that we've seen so far. The background for this list is that it placed in 5th place out of 28 players in the Imps Gaming October Grand Tournament, played by a player named Ryan Pachette. And do notice that this list pretty much just missed the top 4th placing, so this list can probably make the top 4, and do keep an eye out on how unique this list is. This list begins with a brigade detachment being composed of the Mars Forge World and utilizing the Army of Renown known as the Skitarii Veteran Cohort. As a brigade detachment, this list is required to bring 3 HQ choices, with the first one being a Tech Priest Dominus, armed with an Eradication Ray, and a Phosphorus Serpenta. Definitely a decent enough choice, but it's interesting to see a Dominus showing up on the battlefield as opposed to a Manipulus. The second HQ choice is the Skitarii Marshal, as veteran cohorts normally include, and this Marshal is the Warlord of the army, being given the Archived Engagements Warlord trait as well as the Relic of Exemplar's Eternity, which is a very common option on different Skitarii Marshals. As such, it's a rather standard HQ choice, and there's not much to say about it. The third HQ choice, though, is back to again being a little bit interesting, this being an Engine Seer with no additional upgrades. So do you notice something interesting here? This list does not include a Manipulus, and does not include any Holy Order buffs, at least not that I could see on the army list as it was presented. More so, it does include an Engine Seer with no additional upgrades, so there's going to be some utilization of that Engine Seer ability, and as such, I think it's already an exciting start to what's going to be a very exciting list. Now, as this is a brigade detachment, this detachment does require you to have 6 troop choices. The first of those 2 troop choices are 2 units of 5 Skitarii Veteran Rangers, being armed with a data tether, their 4 galvanic rifles, and each squad containing a transuranic arquebus, which is a very interesting include, as normally people find this weapon to be a little overcosted, and as such it does not see much utilization. However, in this situation, this list has brought 2 of them, and the nice thing about being a veteran cohort is that because your units are now veterans, they actually have a little more durability, making some of those special weapons go a little bit further due to the added survivability of being veterans. Now, what's additionally interesting is that the next 4 troop choices are just as exciting, being 4 units of 5 Veteran Vanguard, and each of these units does include an arc rifle. and this is once again a weapon that we haven't really seen in other army lists, showing a very interesting mix of different special weapons on the different units within this list. Also do notice that the Ranger squads did have those data tethers, but the Vanguard squads did not, meaning that there's more intention to support the Ranger squads than the Vanguard squads, and it's interesting to note that now we've seen all three special weapons being utilized in the Skitarii forces. As in the 2000 point list videos, we did see heavy use of plasma calivers, and the fact that this list and that list utilized the special weapons very heavily, as each squad utilized the maximum allocation of those special weapons, it does show that these were intentional and not just a point sink. Now following the rather interesting HQ and troop choices, this list does include some standard options within the elite choice, being 3 units of 5 Sicarian infiltrators to fill out the elite slot, and each of these units is armed with a flechette blaster and a taser goad. Once again, the Sicarian infiltrators are just too good of a unit to pass up, so they're definitely going to show up in the majority of different army lists. Now there are some additional relics on these Sicarian infiltrators, which is a little bit different considering that usually when we see relics on the Sicarian infiltrators, they're usually larger units, but we do see them show up on units of 5 as well, so it's not exactly out of the question that we would see such allocation of relics in this situation. The first squad of 5 infiltrators is given the Omniscient Mask, and the second one is given the Tempercopia, and the third squad has no special relics. This means these units are definitely going into combat at some point and doing their thing with those special relics, as those relics definitely benefit their combat potential. And one thing to mention, I do believe that third squad is probably being escorted by the Skitarii Marshal, as the archived engagements on the Skitarii Marshal doesn't do quite that much on those Skitarii units, and as we'll see with the rest of the list, there isn't as much place to utilize them outside of those Sicarian infiltrator squads, so it's a little bit interesting to see the archived engagements on the Skitarii Marshal as opposed to the third infiltrator squad, but it does make sense as it does save you a little bit of command points, as the Admech forces do tend to be very command point hungry, so a little bit of savings does go a long way, and you always have the option of giving that buff to a different squad by having the Skitarii Marshal escort that squad as opposed to escorting that third squad, which can always function as an objective squad versus a combat squad specifically, so it really does come down to the game that you're playing as opposed to any strict style of play. Now the fast attack choice is filled with 2 fast attack units, each of those fast attack units being a unit of 4 Ballistari Iron Striders, and each of those Iron Striders is armed with a Twin Cognus las cannon. This is a rather standard choice, and it shows that heavy utilization of those Iron Striders with those las cannons is still in play, and is still particularly common even after they've been nerfed, as the amount of firepower and durability you get for the amount of points that these guys cost is very hard to beat, and they're still incredibly prevalent throughout different Admech lists, and I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon, considering how powerful these units are. I do think there might have been some argument of potentially dropping them down to units of 3 and then taking a third unit of 2 just to give yourself a little bit more flexibility in terms of positioning and targeting, but I can definitely see the justification of keeping them in units of 4. This list does include 2 additional fast attack choices, and the third and fourth fast attack choice that this list includes is 2 units of 5 Sulphur Hounds, all of the Sulphur Hounds being armed with pistols, none of them having any special weapons, and this is actually pretty interesting as we haven't really seen any Sulphur Hounds up to this point really reaching the top levels of play within Admech lists. What I'll say about the inclusion of these is that I'm not surprised seeing them, as they're rather powerful units, but they do lack some of the utility that the Raiders provide with the normal lists. However, just like in 8th edition, it did take some time for the Sulphur Hounds to catch on, so it's no surprise that it took a little bit of time for us to start seeing the Sulphur Hounds appearing in top level lists. Though that being said, I do think going into the future we'll be seeing more and more of them, which is somewhat interesting considering normally that units with raw power such as the Sulphur Hounds usually see success before utility units such as the Raiders, though in the situation of the Admech it seemed like the inverse was happening, and that's probably due to the amount of power the Admech have overall, making another power unit a little less interesting than a utility unit that the Admech can sometimes lack in terms of what options they have available to themselves, as Admech tend to be a more raw power army than a utility army. So this leaves one more selection for this army, and I'll give you a chance to guess what that selection is. Is it several flyers, or is it a Scorpius Disintegrator? If you guessed either of those choices, you were actually wrong because this list did something completely different and brought 3 units of a single Dune Crawler, each of those Dune Crawlers being armed with a twin heavy Onager Phosphor Blaster, a heavy stubber, and smoke launchers. This is actually rather interesting because the Phosphor Blaster used to be one of the weakest choices on the Dune Crawler in the previous edition, but going into the 9th edition codex, it did see a lot of improvement, and it was one of those options that people did consider because it did have enough output at the price point to be somewhat interesting, but it does still compete with the Neutron Laser and the Icarus Ray for different utility within the army, so there's definitely debate about which one is best, but as we can see here, that the Phosphor Blaster is definitely one that you can utilize, and the inclusion of these 3 Dune Crawlers concludes the list. So much like the Necron list, it's interesting to know what's not included as much as it is to notice what is included, because all of a sudden this list does not utilize any of the flyers that are normally prevalent throughout Admech lists. It does not include Scorpius Disintegrators, neither does it include Raiders or a Manipulus, and as such, it's kind of interesting to see how this list utilizes some standard units, such as those Infiltrators and Iron Striders, while at the same time utilizing special weapons that aren't very common within Admech lists, and bringing along units like the Sulfurhounds and Doomcrawlers to give itself an advantage. And I'd like to mention, do notice how few Warlord traits and relics this list actually takes, considering most Admech lists do utilize Holy Orders and different traits and relics much more heavily than this list, whereas in this case the Dominus and the Engine Seer are just their support units utilizing their basic abilities that they come armed with naturally, with the Engine Seer probably benefiting the Doomcrawlers, and the Dominus either escorting the Vanguard or hanging back and babysitting the Rangers as they take shots with those Arquebuy. And I hope this list shows how much diversity there is in terms of what Admech can bring to the table, and that you shouldn't just pigeonhole yourself to not utilizing special weapons because most people don't, or utilizing some units like the Flyers just because they happen to be prevalent within the meta at this time. With that being said, which list did you find more interesting, the Necron list or the Admech list? And would you be interested in playing either of these lists? And did either of these lists change the way you perceive when it comes to building one of these armies in terms of how you can build an army list for either of these factions? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you've enjoyed the content, like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. And if you get the opportunity, please do share the channel, as that not only massively helps the channel, but also helps the people who may discover it and benefit from the content. I would also like to give a quick shout out to my patrons. You guys are awesome people. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day.